Karen not only controls the grass in the yard and the window curtains, but now she also wants to control the fire in my backyard. If a dictator is right on the other side of the fence, will you fight back or let yourself be consumed? I'm Daniel Carter, a 35-year-old man with a small yet passionate car garage in the suburbs. I'm not the kind of person who likes to get involved in trouble, but I'm also not the type to bow down when someone tries to push me around. I moved to Woodland Creek hoping to find a peaceful life, a place where I could enjoy the fruits of my labor, sit by the outdoor fireplace, sipping a cold beer after a long workday. But I quickly realized something. Woodland Creek is not as peaceful as it seems. This neighborhood looks like a perfect painting with lush trees, clean cobblestone roads, and houses built in the same modern style. But behind that glamorous beauty lies a suffocating network of control. The Homeowners Association, which is actually a small group manipulated by Karen, imposes a slew of ridiculous rules, from the height of the grass in the yard to the color of the curtains. Anyone who violates them is mercilessly fined. Karen, the chairwoman of the board, is at the center of all these rules. She has a strange thirst for power, wanting to control every nook and cranny of the neighborhood. The residents don't like her, but no one dares to stand up to her. They whisper behind her back, nodding in submission whenever Karen walks by, then quietly follow the meaningless regulations she enforces. I thought I could stay out of trouble. I kept my garden neat, parked my car in the right spot, and even attended a few homeowners meetings to avoid drawing attention. But then, one autumn evening, I lit my outdoor fireplace, something completely legal, not violating any rules. The fire was warm, the sound of the logs cracking mixed with the light smoke rising in the chilly air. I thought I'd have a relaxing evening, until a shrill voice came from the other side of the fence. Daniel Carter. I looked up and saw Karen standing there, arms crossed, her gaze sharp as if I had just set someone's house on fire. She was wearing a light brown suit, her hair pulled up, looking like a military school principal. Do I need to remind you about the neighborhood regulations? Karen stepped forward, her tone stern. I smirked, leaning back in my chair, gently shaking my beer can. I don't think there's a rule that prohibits residents from using an outdoor fireplace unless I missed that in the guidelines. Karen narrowed her eyes. It's a safety issue. What would happen if everyone just started lighting fires like this? I glanced at the fireplace, then back at her. I have a fire guard. The fireplace is installed to code. If safety is the issue, I'm happy to show you the installation permit. Karen's face turned red with anger. She clearly wasn't expecting me to counter her. A tense silence passed. Then she tilted her chin, her voice hardening. I won't argue with you here. Tomorrow morning, you'll receive an official notice from the board. If you don't remove this fireplace within 48 hours, you'll be fined. I laughed, but there was no humor in it. Interesting. Let's see who will be surprised. The next morning, just as Karen had said, I received a fine letter from the board. I held the paper in my hands, reading it over and over as if I couldn't believe my eyes. Fined just for using a legal fireplace in my own backyard? This was nothing but a joke. I could take the easy route, remove it, and avoid the trouble. But I had taken the easy route before when I lived in my old neighborhood. I compromised, accepted the absurdities, only to be pushed out until I had to leave. No, this time, I would not back down. Karen had made a huge mistake trying to push me down that path again. If she wanted a power struggle, I'd play a bigger game. That evening, the fall sky was clear, the cool air drifting through the branches. I pulled the wooden chair out into the backyard, cracked open a beer, and lit the fireplace. The flames erupted, casting a warm glow over the wood around it. I leaned back in the chair, enjoying the peace after a long day's work. There was nothing better than sitting by the fire, watching the sparks rise into the air, listening to the wood crackle in the silence. But that peace didn't last long. The sound of high heels clacking on the stone path startled me. I turned around and immediately recognized Karen's unmistakable figure. Her neat suit, arms crossed, her gaze full of judgment as if I had done something unforgivable. "Daniel Carter," she spoke, each syllable sharp like a judge's gavel. I looked up at her, took a sip of beer, and tried to remain calm. "Hello, Karen. Beautiful evening, isn't it?" She didn't answer, just glanced over at the fireplace with a sneer. "You know you're not allowed to have an open fire here, right?" I raised an eyebrow, squinting at her. "Really?" "I remember the guidelines saying as long as the fireplace is safe and doesn't affect the surrounding environment, it's perfectly legal." "That's the old rule," Karen interrupted. "The board has updated the regulations. Any form of fire must be approved in advance." I laughed, setting the beer can down on the table. "Oh yeah? I didn't see any notice about that." Karen crossed her arms, her chin lifted in challenge. "Maybe you should read more carefully." I knew what this was about. This wasn't about safety or rules. This was about control. Karen wanted to assert that she was the one in charge, that anyone living in Woodland Creek had to obey her. I stared straight into her eyes, keeping my voice calm. "My fireplace has the proper permits. I have no reason to remove it." She clenched her lips, her eyes sharpening. "You'll receive an official notice from the board tomorrow morning. I suggest you comply if you don't want to get into trouble." Without waiting for me to say anything, Karen turned and walked away, her heels clacking sharply on the stone path. I sighed, reaching for the beer can again and taking a long sip. This wasn't over. The next morning, just as Karen had said, I received an envelope from the board. I ripped it open, and inside was a fine notice along with an order to remove the fireplace within 48 hours. If not, I would face a hefty fine. I held the paper, my fingers gripping the edge of the letter tightly. Anger rose in my chest. I had thought the fine was the end of it, but I was wrong. The next morning, I received another letter, this one saying that my garage was being inspected for noise and safety violations. This couldn't be a coincidence. Karen was trying everything she could to make me back down. If I didn't act, my job could be at risk. I ground my teeth, crumpling the paper in my hand. If Karen thought I would just fold like the others, she was underestimating me. I had chosen the easy route before when I lived in my old neighborhood. I gave in, hoping it would keep me out of trouble. But then I realized that when you take a step back, the abuser takes 10 steps forward. And in the end, I was pushed out so much that I had to sell my house and leave. Not this time. I wouldn't make the same mistake again. I decided to contact the board to protest. But when I walked into the office, I quickly realized this wasn't going to be a fair debate. "The decision has been made," one of the board members, a middle-aged man who looked like Karen's lackey, said without even looking up from his paperwork. "You have 48 hours to comply. No exceptions." "I haven't done anything wrong," I insisted. "My fireplace is legal. If she doesn't like it, that's her problem, not mine." The man shrugged, pushing the paper toward me. "I have no authority to change the decision. This is the new rule." I smirked. "I bet this rule was added after Karen saw my fireplace, right?" No one answered, but I noticed a few eyes shifting away. I see. Karen wasn't just the chairwoman, she controlled everything here. I left the office with the fine in hand, frustrated. Some neighbors were standing nearby, sneaking glances at me with sympathetic looks, but no one dared speak up. I understood why. They didn't want to face Karen. They were afraid that if they helped me, they would become the next target. I took a deep breath, clutching the paper in my hand. If Karen thought I would just give in like the others, she was wrong. I knew I couldn't just sit back and let Karen win. If I wanted to keep my fireplace, and more importantly, keep my freedom in my own yard, I needed a plan. That evening, I walked over to Mike's house, one of the few people in the neighborhood who dared to challenge Karen, at least in secret. He was an architect, more knowledgeable about building codes and neighborhood regulations than anyone I knew. I knocked twice, then heard footsteps rushing inside. The door cracked open, and Mike peeked out, looking around before pulling me in. "Are you sure no one saw you come in here?" Mike asked quietly, his voice so low I had to strain to hear him. I shrugged. "I'm no spy, Mike. I just came to ask you about the rules around here." Mike sighed and got straight to the point. "I knew you were coming for this. Your fireplace is completely legal. There's no rule against it as long as you're not starting fires under dangerous conditions. Karen's just trying to push the rules to suit her." I leaned back in the chair, crossing my arms. "So, can I sue them?" Mike chuckled and shook his head. "You can. But do you think you'll win? You think Karen's just going to stop? She'll find any small mistake you make. Trust me, you don't want to open the door and find a pile of fines waiting for you." I tapped my fingers lightly on the table, thinking. "So what can I do?" Mike raised an eyebrow, a grin playing at the corners of his mouth. "You really want to fight back?" "I'm not backing down." Mike nodded slowly. "Then you've got to play big." Play big? The idea suddenly clicked in my mind, and by the time I left Mike's house, I had a plan. If Karen wanted to use the rules to push me around, then I'd use the rules to beat her. That whole week, I prepared my plan. I did everything by the book, applied for permits, sent notifications to the local authorities, and made sure everything I did was legal to the last detail. By the weekend, I built a 10-foot bonfire right in the middle of my backyard. And then, I invited the entire neighborhood. Bonfire night, a legal, well-organized bonfire night, with all the proper permits so the authorities couldn't intervene. I even hired a small band, set up a drink and snack stand. From the moment the sun set, the neighbors started trickling in. At first, they were hesitant, worried that Karen would show up and make a scene. But when they saw my confidence, they began to relax. And then, one by one, they joined the fun. Laughter echoed through the cool autumn evening. The fire crackled, casting its glow on faces slowly shedding the usual constant fear. Some people even whispered to me, "We've always wanted a gathering like this, but Karen forbade everything. I hate how she controls everything." You standing up to her is impressive. And just like I predicted, Karen couldn't let this slide. She showed up about halfway through the evening, her face red with fury. Standing at the edge of the crowd, she scanned the blazing fire, then turned sharply toward me. "Daniel Carter, what do you think you're doing?" I raised my beer can, shrugged. "Throwing a legal gathering with all the proper permits." Karen gritted her teeth. "You're violating the neighborhood rules." I handed her a stack of papers, my tone casual. "Everything's legal, Karen. I've checked every clause. This fire doesn't violate anything." She was so furious she was nearly shaking. Then, in desperation, she pulled out her phone and called the police. When the squad car arrived, the crowd stepped back a little. A police officer got out and slowly walked over to assess the situation. Karen immediately rushed toward him. "They're violating the rules," she yelled. "They're putting the entire neighborhood at risk." The officer looked at her, then at me. "Mr. Carter, do you have a permit for this event?" I handed him the stack of papers, smiling. "All in order." The local authorities approved it. The officer glanced at the papers for a few seconds, then nodded. "Everything checks out." He turned to Karen. "You can't force them to stop." Karen's face went pale. But, you called us here without proper cause," the officer continued, his tone firm. "If you continue to bother us without evidence of a violation, you could face penalties for filing a false report." Defeated, Karen stepped back, her face dark with anger. For the first time since I moved here, I saw her truly scared. And then, the real twist came. After the bonfire that evening, one of the neighbors, a man named Greg, quietly pulled me aside. He looked around to make sure no one could hear, then whispered, "Daniel, I've got something you'll want to see." He handed me a folder. I skimmed through it and immediately recognized the issue. Karen had used the neighborhood fund to renovate her own house without any votes or approval. That evening's board meeting was packed. In contrast to the usual silence, the residents spoke up in unison for the first time. "We want an explanation," a man shouted. Karen stood at the podium, her face tense. She was still trying to control the situation, but panic was evident in her eyes. "It's all a misunderstanding," she stammered. "I only want what's best for the neighborhood." Laughter erupted from the crowd. Someone held up a copy of the documents, the evidence clear for all to see. Karen turned toward me, her eyes full of hatred. "It's you, isn't it? You did this." I crossed my arms, smirking. "No, Karen. You did this to yourself." In the end, when the vote was announced, no one was surprised. Karen was officially removed from the board. She left the meeting quietly, and I knew her power had crumbled forever. She was forced to resign immediately. When she stood before the final meeting, she tried to make excuses, but no one was listening anymore. When her bitter gaze landed on me, I just smiled calmly. This time, she no longer controlled anyone. After everything, Woodlands Creek could finally breathe easy. A new, fairer board was established, one that was more transparent. And me? I sat by the outdoor fireplace, sipping a beer, enjoying the peace I had fought for. At the entrance to the neighborhood, a new sign was hung with a simple but meaningful phrase: "Woodland Creek, a neighborhood of freedom. When faced with injustice, don't remain silent. Tyrants can only survive when no one dares to challenge them. Freedom is not a given, it must be protected. Sometimes, we must stand up and fight for what we deserve." What do you think about this story? Share your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to like and subscribe to the Crazy Neighbor Drama channel to catch the next thrilling stories.